In a peaceful Las Vegas suburb lined with palm trees and pastel-colored houses, everything seemed ordinary. It was the kind of neighborhood where sprinklers clicked on at dawn, kids rode bicycles without a care, and front porches were dressed with rocking chairs and flower pots. But behind the curtain of quiet streets and neighborly smiles, something darker was beginning to fester. Something no one would notice until it was too late. Officer Mark Reynolds lived on the corner of Willow Street in a two-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn and an American flag swaying from the porch. At 46, Mark was a career police officer with over 2 decades on the force. He had earned a reputation for being strict, disciplined, and by the book. Fellow officers often described him as the kind of man who never cracked a smile unless it was part of intimidation. To the outside world, Mark was stable, dependable, and maybe a little old-fashioned. But inside, there was a man growing increasingly bitter and isolated. Mark had served his city for years, but his views had never changed with the times. He believed the world was slipping away from tradition, from order, from the type of America he remembered as a child. He didn't say these things out loud. He didn't have to. They lived in his silence, in his narrowed eyes when certain people walked by, in the subtle sneer when he wrote up a report involving anyone he didn't believe belonged. His uniform gave him authority, and that authority fed a quiet superiority that was invisible to most who passed him by. Just 2 houses down, 23-year-old Aaliyah Jackson lived with her elderly grandmother, Miss Lorraine, in a modest 1-story home with peeling paint, but a warm and lively heart. Aaliyah had moved back in after college to help care for her grandmother and save money while applying for nursing school. She was bright, ambitious, and had a quiet strength about her. Most afternoons she could be seen sitting on the porch with her books, headphones on, legs folded beneath her as she highlighted chapters with focus. She wore colorful clothes, her hair in long braids, and often smiled to herself as she read. She didn't have many friends in the neighborhood, mostly older residents, but she always greeted everyone with kindness. Mark noticed her the day she moved in. At first it was nothing more than a passing glance, but that glance became a stare, then a habit. Soon, he found himself watching her from the window each time she stepped outside. He learned her schedule, when she watered the plants, when she took her grandmother to the store, when she went jogging. She became a fixation he couldn't explain and didn't want to stop. There was something about her youth, her confidence, her spirit, that made him feel something unfamiliar and unsettling. It was desire, but it was tangled with resentment. To Mark, Aaliyah represented a world he no longer understood. She was free, in ways he had never been. She was black, young, hopeful, and all the things that Mark deep down had grown to despise in silence. He would never have admitted that his thoughts were rooted in prejudice. In his mind, he was just observing, just keeping an eye on the neighborhood, just being a good officer. But it went further than that. Soon, Mark began taking different routes home from work to ensure he passed her house. He walked his dog closer to her driveway, pretending not to look as he glanced through her windows. He noticed what time her lights went out. He noted who visited. He started calling in to dispatch late at night, pretending to check on the area, all just to drive by her house again. To anyone else, it would have seemed harmless, an older neighbor watching out for a young woman. But the truth was much more sinister. Aaliyah never suspected anything. Why would she? Mark wore a badge. He represented safety. He had once helped her jump-start her car when her battery died. He even brought in her trash cans once during a storm. She saw him as just another neighbor, quiet, serious, maybe a little odd, but nothing more. She didn't know he had a telescope in his upstairs bedroom, pointed directly at her house. She didn't know he had a file saved on his computer with pictures of her, taken without her knowing. She didn't know that the man who held authority over her entire neighborhood had begun to believe she belonged to him. Mark's loneliness had been growing for years. His wife had left him nearly a decade earlier, unable to handle his coldness and controlling nature. He had no children, no real friends. The department respected him for his record, not for who he was. At night, he drank alone and listened to old police scanner tapes. He read old case files like bedtime stories. His entire identity was wrapped in power and control. And now, in his mind, Aaliyah was part of that world too. He began fantasizing about saving her, protecting her, being the one she turned to when she felt scared. He imagined her crying in his arms, grateful for his strength. These thoughts were never about love. They were about possession. Mark saw Aaliyah not as a human being, but as something to conquer, something to tame. And so the pattern continued. Aaliyah had no idea she was being watched. Her focus remained on school, her grandmother, and her future. She applied to nursing programs and took night classes at the community college. Occasionally she dated, though nothing serious. She dreamed of leaving Las Vegas one day, of working in a children's hospital and starting her own life. She had plans, and she wasn't afraid to chase them. But Mark didn't want her to leave. The idea of her moving away, slipping from his grasp, made him feel panic he couldn't explain. He believed he had invested something in her. Time, attention, thought. In his mind, she owed him. He began justifying his behavior, telling himself he was keeping her safe, that no one else could care for her the way he could. The line between duty and obsession had vanished. Now it was just him and the fantasy he had built in silence. Las Vegas shimmered in the distance, full of noise and light, but on this quiet street a storm was brewing. Two houses stood near each other, divided by a narrow strip of grass, yet worlds apart in truth. One held a young woman with dreams and a heart full of hope. The other held a man with a badge and a growing darkness inside him. No one in the neighborhood suspected anything. Not yet. But something irreversible had already begun. And soon, the illusion of safety would shatter, leaving only questions, grief, and a terrible secret buried beneath the surface. Mark Reynolds's fascination with Aaliyah Jackson quietly deepened into something more intense and dangerous, though no one in the neighborhood noticed the change. To outsiders, Mark was still the same reserved officer, polite when needed but mostly keeping to himself. Inside, his mind was consumed by thoughts of her, blurring the line between protection and obsession until it vanished altogether. It began with small things that seemed harmless at first. Mark would occasionally stop by Aaliyah's house under the pretense of checking the neighborhood's safety. Sometimes he'd mention a supposed crime wave nearby, warning her to be careful, though nothing had happened. Sometimes he helped her carry groceries or fixed a loose gate latch, always making sure to be near when she was outside. She was cautious, but polite, not wanting to offend the man who wore a badge and lived so close. But these visits were not driven by neighborly kindness. Mark's actions were calculated, his intentions darker. He wanted control over her, a connection no one else could have. Each small favor, each casual conversation, was a thread in a web he was weaving. He imagined that soon she would come to depend on him, not just as an officer or neighbor, but as someone who understood her better than anyone else. Aaliyah, young and hopeful, found herself confused. Mark was older, yes, and sometimes his presence felt too intense, but he offered something she hadn't experienced before, a sense of attention and importance. After years of struggling to be noticed or supported, his focus on her felt like a strange kind of validation. She began to see him as a protector, someone who cared. Mark used this to his advantage. He made himself indispensable in her daily life, always present at the right moment. When she had car trouble, Mark was there with tools and advice. When her grandmother fell ill briefly, Mark checked in more often, offering help. Slowly, Aaliyah lowered her guard. She accepted rides from him and let him into her home under the guise of fixing things or helping out. Behind closed doors, Mark's obsession grew. He started crossing lines he never imagined he would. He installed hidden cameras outside her house, disguised as motion sensors and lights. He hacked into her phone records through his police connections, tracking who she called and when. His department access gave him tools no ordinary person could use, and he exploited them without hesitation. No one would suspect a respected officer of such invasive actions. At the same time, Mark's feelings twisted into a dangerous combination of anger and jealousy. He convinced himself that Aaliyah belonged to him, that her attention, her time, and her trust were debts she owed. When she began spending more time with friends her age and stopped returning his calls immediately, Mark felt a rage that simmered just beneath the surface. The idea that she might be interested in someone else was unbearable. Unbeknownst to Mark, Aaliyah had started seeing a young man named David, a fellow student from her nursing program. Their relationship was new and fragile, but filled with genuine affection. David was kind, attentive, and from her community. Everything Mark was not. For the first time in a long while, Aaliyah felt free from the shadow of control that had been creeping closer. Mark's paranoia grew. He watched her more closely, waiting for signs, tracking her movements. One evening, from his bedroom window, he saw Aaliyah and David walking hand in hand down the street, laughing. That moment shattered the fragile fantasy Mark had built. His mind filled with images of losing her, of being replaced, and something inside him snapped. At work, the change in Mark was noticeable to a few colleagues. His patience was thinner, his temper shorter. Routine tasks became excuses for aggression. Officers who once respected him began avoiding him, sensing something off. But no one wanted to challenge the veteran cop openly. They whispered concerns in private, but the culture of silence and loyalty ran deep. Mark's obsession began affecting his duties. He started using his police access for personal reasons, checking Aaliyah's social media accounts through official channels, pulling up her background information, even going so far as to access surveillance cameras around her neighborhood. The department had rules against such actions, but Mark manipulated records to cover his tracks. Aaliyah's attempts to distance herself grew stronger. She stopped answering his calls and messages, hoping to break free from the unwanted attention. But Mark refused to accept rejection. The man who had spent his career enforcing rules now broke them to satisfy his need for control. One night, Mark waited outside Aaliyah's house long after she had gone inside. He paced in his car, watching the windows, clutching his phone, trying to calm the storm inside him. His obsession was no longer hidden. It had become a dangerous fixation that clouded his judgment and morality. The tension between them was invisible to the world, but thick with threat. Aaliyah felt uneasy, but could not pinpoint why. The kind gestures felt forced. The timing of Mark's appearances felt calculated. A shadow had fallen over what should have been a safe place. Mark's fantasies of ownership twisted further. He began planning ways to isolate Aaliyah from others, imagining a life where she depended solely on him. In his mind, the line between love and possession blurred until only darkness remained. The growing divide between their worlds was set to collide, but no one yet knew how violently it would unfold. Mark's obsession, fueled by power and prejudice, had taken root, and soon it would demand a terrible price. In the midst of this, the quiet Las Vegas suburb remained unaware. Life went on. Children played. Neighbors greeted one another. But behind the curtains, behind the doors, a deadly game was beginning, one that would change everything. Mark Reynolds's world grew darker and more unstable as his obsession with Aaliyah Jackson spiraled out of control. The man who once prided himself on law and order was now consumed by jealousy and rage, emotions that twisted his thoughts and actions in ways even he could no longer control. What began as a dangerous fixation had evolved into a destructive force that threatened not only Aaliyah's life but Mark's very soul. After witnessing Aaliyah with David, the young man she had begun seeing secretly, Mark felt a crushing blow to his pride. That night, the image of them laughing together, touching hands, filled him with a bitter mix of hatred and despair. The idea that Aaliyah could choose someone else, someone younger, freer, and from a world Mark despised, was unbearable. In his mind, she was his possession, something he had worked to earn, and the thought of losing her sent him into a downward spiral. Mark's behavior grew erratic and dangerous. He stopped pretending to be the calm, professional officer his colleagues knew. Instead, he began showing signs of paranoia. At work, his temper flared unexpectedly. He argued with fellow officers over small matters and reacted aggressively during routine traffic stops. Yet no one questioned his mental state openly. The culture in the department demanded silence, loyalty, and above all, protecting their own. Mark's record and years of service gave him a shield from scrutiny. At home, Mark's obsession took on a darker form. He installed surveillance cameras pointed directly at Aaliyah's home, hidden cleverly among the streetlights and the trees. These cameras captured her every move, who she talked to, when she left the house, even moments inside her yard. Mark spent hours watching the footage late into the night, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent plotting and fearing at once. But watching was not enough. Mark needed more control. Using his police department access, he hacked into Aaliyah's phone records and social media accounts, tracking her calls and messages. Every text she sent, every call she made, was logged and analyzed. He even began accessing nearby traffic cameras and neighborhood surveillance, piecing together her daily routine like a puzzle. No one suspected the officer who was supposed to protect them was violating every rule he swore to uphold. Despite his invasive surveillance, Aaliyah remained unaware of the full extent of Mark's intrusion. She felt uneasy around him, but could not explain why. When she saw him unexpectedly near her grandmother's house or on her usual walking routes, a knot tightened in her stomach. The friendly, neighborly gestures no longer felt genuine. They felt calculated. She had started to realize she needed distance, but felt trapped by his looming presence. Meanwhile, Mark's jealousy grew more violent. He imagined Aaliyah with David, seeing them as a threat not just to his control, but to his very identity. To Mark, David was everything he despised: young, black, and from a different background. Mark's racist beliefs mixed with his obsession, turning David into an enemy he needed to eliminate. He began following David's social media accounts, learning his schedule, even driving past the places David was known to frequent. One night, Mark's rage boiled over. Returning home from a late shift, he spotted David walking down the street with Aaliyah. The sight was like a dagger to his heart. Mark's grip tightened around the steering wheel. Without thinking, he pulled his car alongside them, staring coldly from behind the tinted window. Aaliyah looked startled, glancing between Mark's car and David, her face pale with fear. Mark's mind raced. He told himself he was protecting Aaliyah, that David was a danger to her. The rationalizations gave him permission to cross lines that once held him back. The obsession that began as a quiet fixation had mutated into a dangerous, unpredictable force. At the police station, Mark's abuse of power became harder to hide. His colleagues noticed he was using department resources for personal reasons but remained silent out of fear or loyalty. One officer who tried to raise concerns was quickly warned to keep quiet. Mark's reputation as a veteran officer protected him. He was untouchable. Aaliyah's attempts to distance herself became desperate. She stopped answering his calls and texts, blocked him on social media, and refused to meet him in person. She confided in a few close friends about her fears, but didn't tell her grandmother, not wanting to cause worry. The young woman who once welcomed Mark's help now saw him as a shadow stalking her every step. Mark's obsession would not be denied. One evening, after hours of watching surveillance footage, he decided to confront Aaliyah. He arrived at her house unannounced, pretending to check on her after hearing a false report of suspicious activity nearby. She was cautious, but let him in when he offered to fix a broken window latch. Inside the house, Mark's true intentions showed. The polite neighbor became threatening and controlling. He demanded to know who she had been seeing, accusing her of betrayal. Aaliyah was frightened but tried to remain calm. The man who was supposed to protect her was now a source of fear. Over the next weeks, Mark escalated his behavior. He sent her gifts, flowers, small tokens, with notes implying he was always watching. He waited outside her classes and followed her to appointments. Aaliyah felt her freedom slipping away, trapped by a man who could ruin her life with a single word or gesture. One night, Mark's anger exploded. Believing Aaliyah was lying about seeing David, he broke into her house while she was out. He rifled through her belongings, searching for evidence. He planted false information to create mistrust between her and her friends. The man who swore to uphold the law had become a criminal in his own right. Aaliyah, sensing the danger growing around her, reached out to a local community center for help. She spoke to counselors about harassment and fear, but didn't want to involve the police, fearing Mark's connections and power. The support workers urged her to document everything and consider legal protection, but the threat felt overwhelming. As Mark's obsession deepened, so did his isolation. Friends and family drifted away, alarmed by his increasing instability. His drinking worsened, and he spent more nights alone in his house, obsessively checking cameras and police records. The badge that once symbolized respect and honor had become a tool of control and destruction. Aaliyah's life was on the brink. She lived each day walking a dangerous line between hope and fear. Mark Reynolds, a man sworn to protect, had become her greatest threat. The secret affair that began with manipulation had transformed into a deadly game of power and control. In the shadows of the Las Vegas suburb, the quiet streets hid a nightmare growing louder with each passing day, one that would soon explode into tragedy and reveal the dark underbelly of power abused, obsession unchecked, and justice denied. The tension between Mark Reynolds and Aaliyah Jackson reached a breaking point. Mark's obsession had become an uncontrollable storm, and Aaliyah's fear had turned into a constant heavy weight that shadowed every moment of her life. What had once seemed like a confusing, uncomfortable attraction had escalated into a dangerous situation with deadly consequences looming just ahead. Mark's behavior became increasingly unpredictable and violent. He no longer bothered to hide his anger or jealousy. When he was on duty, his aggression flared without warning. Several colleagues noticed the change but kept their distance. One afternoon, after a routine call, Mark stormed into the station and smashed a chair in frustration. This outburst shocked everyone. Mark had never been so openly volatile. Still, the department did not take action, unwilling to confront one of their own. Meanwhile, Mark's control over Aaliyah tightened. He installed tracking software on her phone, accessed her private messages, and intercepted her calls. His police credentials gave him unrestricted access to databases and surveillance systems, which he abused without remorse. He became a silent predator, watching her every move from the shadows. Aaliyah grew more isolated. She stopped attending nursing classes and missed family gatherings, afraid that Mark might confront her publicly or worse. Her once lively personality dulled under the weight of constant fear and anxiety. The young woman who dreamed of helping, others now spent nights awake, wondering if she could escape the man who haunted her. One day, David, Aaliyah's boyfriend, noticed the changes in her. She was jumpy, distracted, and unwilling to talk about what was wrong. David wanted to protect her, but didn't know how. When he confronted her gently, Aaliyah finally revealed the nightmare she was living with Mark Reynolds. The news shocked David, who immediately promised to help her find a way out. Together, they sought legal advice and support from community organizations. Aaliyah filed a restraining order against Mark, hoping it would keep him away. However, Mark's access to police resources made the process complicated. He used his influence to delay and undermine the case, exploiting loopholes and intimidating witnesses. Despite the legal measures, Mark did not stop. He began stalking Aaliyah openly. One evening, as she left a friend's house, Mark appeared suddenly from behind a tree, blocking her path. His eyes burned with rage and desperation. Aaliyah froze, heart pounding, but managed to run away before he could reach her. This incident triggered a police investigation, but Mark's colleagues struggled to act. His status and reputation shielded him. Some officers doubted Aaliyah's claims, influenced by Mark's years of service and apparent professionalism. Others feared retaliation or damaging the department's image. The culture of silence and loyalty protected Mark, even as evidence mounted. Aaliyah's situation grew more perilous. One night, Mark broke into her grandmother's house while Aaliyah was visiting. He searched the rooms, looking for anything to use against her or David. The intrusion shattered the last sense of safety she had. Her grandmother was terrified but didn't know how to protect them. Feeling trapped, Aaliyah and David planned to move away from Las Vegas. They wanted to start fresh, far from the shadow Mark cast over their lives. But Mark caught wind of the plan. Fueled by jealousy and rage, he decided to act before they could escape. Late one night, Mark followed Aaliyah as she walked home alone. His car pulled up beside her, and he ordered her inside. Terrified, Aaliyah obeyed, knowing resistance could provoke a worse outcome. Mark drove to a secluded area outside the city, his mind filled with dark intentions. The confrontation was brutal. Mark demanded to know why she wanted to leave him, accusing her of betrayal and lying. His tone shifted between pleading and threatening, revealing the dangerous depths of his obsession. Aaliyah tried to stay calm, pleading for release. But Mark's control slipped further. In a sudden moment of violence, Mark attacked Aaliyah, leaving her injured and terrified. She managed to escape and ran towards a nearby road, screaming for help. A passing driver stopped and called the police, setting off a chain of events that would expose the dark truth. The investigation reopened with renewed urgency. Evidence from the attack, combined with earlier reports, forced the department to act. Mark was suspended and placed under internal review, but the damage was done. The community was shocked to learn that a trusted officer had become a predator. As the case unfolded, more victims and witnesses came forward. Stories emerged of Mark's abusive behavior, intimidation, and misuse of power. The police department faced public outrage and calls for accountability. Mark's downfall became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority and racial bias within law enforcement. Aaliyah's courage inspired others to speak out. Despite the trauma, she testified against Mark in court, determined to seek justice. David stood by her side, supporting her through the legal battle and recovery. Their fight became a beacon of hope for victims of abuse and discrimination. Mark Reynolds was eventually convicted of assault and several other charges related to his stalking and harassment of Aaliyah. The trial revealed a disturbing pattern of racism and abuse of power that shocked many. His sentence was long, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the betrayal of trust. The case led to changes within the Las Vegas Police Department. New policies were introduced to prevent abuse of power and improve accountability. Training on racial bias and officer conduct became mandatory. Community outreach programs aimed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and residents. Aaliyah slowly rebuilt her life, focusing on healing and her nursing career. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence and police misconduct, sharing her story to raise awareness. Her strength and resilience inspired many, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and justice can prevail. The tragic affair between Mark Reynolds and Aaliyah Jackson left deep scars, but also sparked a movement for change. It exposed the deadly consequences of obsession, racism, and abuse of power, lessons that echoed far beyond the quiet streets of the Las Vegas neighborhood. The story served as a powerful reminder that justice must always be vigilant, especially when those sworn to protect become the greatest threat. The trial of Mark Reynolds gripped the city of Las Vegas, shining a harsh light on a disturbing case that revealed much more than a tragic personal downfall. It became a public reckoning with issues of racism, abuse of power, and institutional failure within the police force. What started as a private nightmare for Aaliyah Jackson transformed into a story that challenged the very foundation of trust between the community and those sworn to protect it. From the start, the courtroom was filled with tension. Mark sat in the defendant's chair, a man once respected and feared in the department, now facing charges that threatened to end his career and freedom. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showing his stalking behavior, testimonies from Aaliyah and witnesses, and proof of his unauthorized access to private information. The prosecution laid out a detailed narrative of obsession, manipulation, and violence that shocked everyone present. Aaliyah's testimony was both courageous and heart-wrenching. She spoke about the fear that had taken over her life, the invasion of privacy, and the physical and emotional abuse she endured. Her words painted a vivid picture of how someone in a position of authority could use that power to terrorize an innocent person. The courtroom was silent as she described the moment Mark attacked her, her voice steady but filled with pain. Mark's defense tried to downplay the accusations, attempting to portray him as a devoted officer who had simply made mistakes driven by personal feelings. They argued that his actions were not racially motivated, and that Aaliyah had exaggerated the extent of his behavior. However, the mounting evidence and multiple witnesses contradicted this version. The jury saw through the defense's attempts to justify Mark's abuse of power. One of the most significant revelations during the trial was the culture within the Las Vegas Police Department. Several officers admitted to ignoring or covering up Mark's misconduct. Internal emails and reports showed how complaints against him had been minimized or dismissed to protect the department's reputation. This institutional complicity became a crucial point in the case, demonstrating how systemic failures allowed Mark's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. Community activists and local leaders watched the trial closely. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Aaliyah and calling for police reform. The case became a rallying point for those fighting against racial discrimination and abuse within law enforcement. Media coverage brought national attention, exposing the dark side of policing in one of America's most famous cities. As the trial progressed, new details emerged about Mark's personal life. Friends and family described a man who was struggling with deep-seated anger and prejudice, a man whose racist attitudes had long influenced his actions both on and off duty. This background helped the jury understand the motivations behind the stalking and violence, revealing how personal hatred had twisted his sense of justice. The defense's final efforts to mitigate Mark's guilt fell flat. The judge's instructions to the jury emphasized the seriousness of the charges and the importance of holding officers accountable for abusing their power. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts, including assault, stalking, and violating civil rights. Mark Reynolds was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The judge condemned his actions as a betrayal of the oath he had taken as a police officer. The sentence sent a clear message that no one, regardless of their position or status, was above the law. For Aaliyah, it was a moment of relief, but also a reminder of the long road ahead. In the aftermath of the trial, the Las Vegas Police Department faced intense pressure to reform. The mayor appointed an independent commission to investigate the department's handling of the case and other complaints of misconduct. Recommendations included stronger oversight, mandatory bias training, and improved mechanisms for reporting abuse without fear of retaliation. Aaliyah became an outspoken advocate for change. She worked with local organizations to support victims of abuse and to push for police accountability. Her story was featured in news reports, documentaries, and community forums. She spoke at events dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and racial injustice, turning her personal pain into a powerful force for good. David remained by her side throughout, their relationship growing stronger as they faced the challenges together. They moved away from Las Vegas to start fresh, away from the shadows of fear and trauma. Despite everything, they held on to hope for a future free from violence and control. The community responded with a mix of grief and determination. Many residents who had once trusted the police felt betrayed, but the case sparked important conversations about race, power, and justice. neighborhood groups organized meetings to discuss ways to improve safety and cooperation with law enforcement. The scars left by Mark's actions would take time to heal, but the collective resolve to prevent such tragedies again gave a sense of purpose. Mark Reynolds's fall from grace was a stark reminder of the dangers when those tasked with protecting the public misuse their authority. His actions not only destroyed a young woman's life, but also fractured the trust between a community and its police. The story served as a call to vigilance, urging society to hold officers accountable and to address the deep-rooted issues of racism and abuse in law enforcement. In the years that followed, Aaliyah's experience became a case study in police reform efforts across the country. Her bravery inspired policies aimed at protecting victims and ensuring transparency. The Las Vegas Police Department, once criticized for its silence and complicity, gradually rebuilt its reputation by embracing change and accountability. Ultimately, the story of Mark Reynolds and Aaliyah Jackson was more than a crime tale. It was a powerful narrative about survival, justice, and the ongoing fight against systemic abuse. It showed how one woman's courage could challenge a flawed system and ignite hope for a safer, fairer future. The deadly affair that began in the quiet streets of a Las Vegas neighborhood ended with a message that resonated far beyond the city's limits. No one is above the law, and justice must always prevail.